Today we've got Adam Christianson, who has graciously agreed to return and speak to us again. And today's topic, just to back up a little bit, Adam is the MacCast podcaster that we all know about. So we're lucky to have him agree to come speak to us. And the topic today is M1 processor updates. So we'll see what kind of updates there are for that topic. Adam, go ahead.
Hey, how you doing? Can everybody hear me okay?
Perfect.
Cool. But I also have to see if, so I'm new to this Ring Central, but it looks, whoops, excuse me, so I already messed it up. Feels a lot like Zoom, so I think this will work. I'm gonna try and share my screen here and we'll see if I can do this.
What you might have to do is restart the Ring Central app. Those of us who've shared screens before have to do that the first time, so that might help.
All right, well, let's see if this works. I'm gonna hit share and you tell me if you're seeing my keynote, basically.
Got it.
Yes.
Got it.
Yes.
All right, cool.
I see a title.
We did it.
Hey.
Yeah, all right. So as was mentioned, I'm going to be talking today about the new M1Pro, M1 Max systems that Apple just announced, about a month or so ago. So we're going to be digging into kind of some of the technology and talking about some of the differences and maybe trying to help people out if you're thinking about one of these new systems, you know, how to like pick which one would be right for you, which configurations and whatnot. Was already sort of mentioned who I am. My name's Adam Christianson. I do a podcast called the MacCast, actually a podcast I've been doing for 16 years. I believe it's the longest running Apple podcast out there, as far as I know. If you listen to podcasts, you can find it pretty much on every platform, obviously Apple Podcast app or wherever you like to get your podcasts if you're into podcasts. And I, have been in the community for a long time. I actually served on a couple of boards myself, so I've been through these elections both in Portland, the Portland Macintosh Users Group, and here in San Diego. Because I should mention I'm in San Diego, actually North County Vista, and I've also served on the board for the San Diego Macintosh Users Group. So let's just dive into these new processors. So some people might be familiar with this guy, the toasted Intel Bunnyman. About a year ago, Apple announced that they were doing another processor transition. Those of us who have been around in this community for a long time have probably been through several of these, maybe all of them. It's actually the fourth major processor transition. We started with the Motorola 6800s. We moved to the IBM PowerPC, and that's when this ad campaign came out where they were sort of ribbing Intel. And then, as a lot of people are probably familiar with, one of our most recent transitions was the Intel transition, and we've been on Intel for a long time. And then a year ago, Apple announced we're moving off of Intel. We're going to go to our own custom designed processors. And they announced the first generation in 2020, the Apple M1, along with the new, MacBook Air and the Mac Mini and the MacBook Pro 13-inch model. So let's talk a little bit about, I wanted to start talking a little bit about the processors and what kind of makes them different, and also some of the things that sort of make them the same and familiar to what we've seen in the past. So, the M1 is the first Apple designed system on a chip for the Mac. It is designed and built by it's designed by Apple. It's actually built by a company called Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, TSMC. They actually do the fabrication, and the designs actually license a technology called ARM, which is an acronym for Advanced RISC Machines. ARM Holdings is actually a British company. They do actually design chips themselves as well. You might be familiar with those in products. You'll see ARM referenced in other products, but Apple actually does their own chip designs, because what they actually license from ARM is just the instruction set. So ARM also licenses the instruction set. And that RISC term we might be familiar with from the IBM PowerPC days. IBM was also RISC, and RISC stands for Reduced Instruction Set Computing. And it's different from what we had with Intel and the x86 processors, which is a CISC system, or complex instruction set computers. And so the main difference, and the reason I'm bringing this up, is to kind of talk about some of the benefits of the M1. And the idea behind reduced instruction set computing is that you limit the instruction sets to smaller sets of functions and that are done on the processor, and then everything else is sort of done in software. That's just kind of a real high level. I'm not a super deep chip engineer, but that kind of gives you the basics. And the main benefits of that are more performance and more efficiency. So that means you can do more with less power. And as we know, Apple likes to make their designs thin and light. And anybody who's used sort of Intel, especially laptops over the years, or just any of the Intel systems, know, we've been dealing with heat and fans and laptops that you can't really use on your lap sometimes because they get so warm. And so Apple was really looking to make a transition and basing a lot of the technology on the designs that they did for iPads and iPhones. Those are also all ARM-based chips. And so that's what they were looking to do. And the hope is that this is going to be the platform that we're going to be on for quite a while. So what makes Apple's CPUs different? Like why should we care? And what's this idea of system on a chip? So along with the ARM instruction set and sort of having their own designs, I mentioned earlier, they use a system on a chip. And what that means basically is, in the past, you would have your processor board and you'd have different components. You'd have your CPU, and that would be separate from your graphics processor, and that would be separate from your memory. And you might have some IO controller chips to kind of move everything around. You might have other kinds of chips in there, image processing chips, security chips, and all these things would be sort of laid out on the board. What the system on a chip does is that moves that all into a single piece of silicon and integrates that. And that also is where we gain performance, because you're not having to move these things around, all over the board. So that's sort of kind of the background of just the chip and the chip technology and how we got here. I don't know if anybody has any questions. I like to do these things kind of interactive. So if there's any questions about that, I can take any questions on that. Otherwise, we'll move on and we'll kind of talk about the actual latest processors, the M1Pro and the M1 Max. All right, I don't see any hands raised or any questions, so we'll just move on. And just a reminder, I have about 45 minutes. Is that right? Time-wise? Yep, I'm seeing nodding. Great, perfect. All right, so as I mentioned, Apple came out about a year ago with their first processor for the Mac, and that was the M1. More recently, they've come out with sort of I don't know if we want to call it the second generation. It's the sort of 1.5 generation, because we are expecting an M2 and probably M3s as we move on. But the M1 was kind of their what you would call their consumer level processor. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, because there's some interesting things about Apple Silicon in these M series processors that make them a little bit different than I think sort of the processors we're used to in the past. And it'll come into play when you're trying to think about a new Mac system, and do I get an M1 or do I get an M1 Pro, or now we also have the M1 Max, and so where do I fall in that line when I'm looking at a new Mac? And so the M1 was the first one. We now have the M1 Pro, and the M1 Pro has either 8 or 10 CPU cores. So within that chip, you've got basically multi-core processors. And the M1 Pro comes in a couple different configurations that are just slightly different. So you can either have 8 or 10, and I guess this is another thing we should talk about. Within those cores, Apple does what they call performance cores that are used for, the sort of high performance processes on your computer, but then they also include what they call efficiency cores. And those take less power, give you longer battery life, and are used for processes when you're maybe doing something less intensive. Maybe you're just doing email or you're just surfing the internet. And so the processor is smart enough to know when to switch between these things. And again, the key here is you're trying to optimize efficiency versus performance, really to try and give you better battery life, less heat, because when processors get hot, they have to slow down. If they run not as hot, you don't have to put as big fans or sophisticated cooling systems in there. So these are all really big benefits. So the M1 Pro is 8 to 10 cores, these 6 to 8 performance cores, and 2 high efficiency cores. And then also within there, you have basically integrated graphics. So you have 14 or 16 GPU cores. And a big deal with these newer processors, the Pro processors, is the original M1s offered you either 8 gigabytes or 16 gigabytes of memory. These new systems deliver 16 gigabytes or 32 gigabytes, and even can go all the way up to 64 gigabytes. So a lot more memory. Again, the idea is this is targeted more at the Pro user, where the M1 is kind of targeted at your average consumer. And then on the M1 Pro, there's 200 gigabits per second of memory bandwidth. So the memory is really fast. So that's moving the memory between the CPU and the GPU cores, because they do this unified memory. And I'll talk a little bit about what unified memory means. Unified memory is a little bit different than traditional memory. So I mentioned that with traditional memory, you have it separated here, and the idea here is that when you have integrated graphics, like Intel integrated graphics, which we've had on a lot of our Intel systems, when the memory is shared, part of that memory has to be reserved for the GPU in sort of the traditional memory configuration. So if you had 16 gigabytes of RAM and your GPU had 2 gigabytes, what you really get is 14 gigabytes for your computer and 2 gigabytes that gets dedicated to the GPU. With this new unified memory architecture, and then the disadvantage of that is the CPU and GPU are working kind of independently, and they're having to pass information back and forth. So it's a little less efficient. With Apple's new unified memory, all the components have access to the same memory. It's all in the same place. So it's really, really fast. And it eliminates the need to move this memory back and forth, and then increase performance. And you can also ramp up depending upon what you're doing. So if the GPU needs more memory, it can take it. If the system needs more memory, it can take it. So it's all unified and optimized. And then the other couple pieces in this processor, they do have Apple's Neural Engine, which is used for their artificial intelligence and machine learning. And then also for pros, and this is a pretty big deal, there's a media engine that has integrated hardware video decoders, video encoders. And then the big thing with the new pros is that they have a dedicated encoder for Apple's ProRes codec, which is the thing that video professionals use. And it enables that to be much, much more efficient. So I kind of wanted to give you a look at the actual processor. So this image is from Apple. This is the M1 Pro. And so that thing in the middle that you see there is what we've been talking about. That's the system on the chip. So that has the processor, the GPU, all the IO controllers, the signal processor. It's all built into that. And then on the same sort of piece of silicon you have on either side, that's your memory. And I'm showing you this because I want to kind of illustrate kind of some of the differences between the M1 Pro and the M1 Max. So if we go back, just quick reminder, so the Pro is 8 to 10 cores, 14 to 16 GPU cores, and then 200 gigabits per second of memory bandwidth. So looking at the Max, so going to the next level, that has 10 cores. It has 8 performance cores, 2 high efficiency cores. And so one thing I want you to note there is note that the M1 Pro and the M1 Max both offer a 10 core configuration with the same number of performance cores and the same number of high efficiency cores. And that's going to sort of come into play when we talk about, like, you know, what system do I buy? What does it matter? The big difference ends up being the GPU cores and that memory bandwidth. So the memory bandwidth is doubled to 400 gigabits per second, and the GPU cores go up to 24 and 32. So you have a lot more GPU. And so they're really the big difference on the Max that you're going to see is going to come into play when you're doing applications like photography editing, video editing, 3D rendering and modeling, those sorts of things, gaming. So if you're doing those higher end things, that's where those extra GPU cores are going to come into play. And then also they double up the hardware and video encoding. So there's still just one video decoder, but you get 2 video encoders and 2 ProRes encoders. And if you look at this processor, what you see here is basically everything is just kind of doubled up. So it's almost like they take the M1 Pro and they just kind of mush 2 together, and now they have the M1 Max. That's simplifying it a little bit, but I'm illustrating this because we are also expecting, so this is Apple's next generation, or their generation of Pro processors for mobile computing. We are expecting them to come out with some amazing new processors for their next desktop systems. So the next iMac, like a 27-inch iMac, is what's being expected update, and also their Mac Pro is expected to get an Apple Silicon update. Well, we know Apple actually made a goal. They're going to transition all of their systems in 2 years, and I think we're about half to 2/3 of the way into that. And so what's expected to happen with the new Pro processors is we're expecting to see the M1 Max basically doubled up again and then quadrupled up. So they have a sort of 2-chip version of this, and they have a 4-chip version of this. And so just think of all those cores kind of doubling and quadrupling, all the GPU cores doubling and quadrupling, and you can see the kind of like performance and power that we're like heading to with these new chips. So any questions on the chips themselves and sort of the designs and that sort of thing? All right. So I want to move on, and I want to talk a little bit about performance. And we're going to look at benchmarks just because I think it's an easier way to kind of visualize it. Obviously, real world performance is what most people care about. Like, how is it going to work for me? But these graphs will kind of give us some visual things that I wanted to talk about. So that top graph right there, what it's showing is just some Geekbench. That's a testing tool for performance testing CPUs, and it's showing single core benchmarks. So I mentioned all of these new processors have multiple cores, but when you're doing different applications, depending upon the application and what sort of it needs, it can either run, and how it's designed, it can either run just on a single core or a multi-core. And so a lot of the applications I think that most of us use on a daily basis are probably really only using a single core. So we're talking about you doing email or maybe a Word document or a Pages document or something like that. It's not generally going to need multiple cores. It's not going to need to engage multiple of these CPU cores to do their work. And so when you're looking at these processors from a single core performance, you see the M1, that chip that Apple introduced 2 years ago, its score is almost identical to the M1 Pro score and the M1 Max score. And that's because these chips are basically all the same designs in terms of the individual cores. And again, I'm kind of oversimplifying here, but what I'm trying to point out here is that when you're doing those kinds of tasks, the performance is going to be almost identical, whether you have an M1, an M1 Pro, or an M1 Max. But what you can see is there is a significant jump. And I will point out here the M1 Pro, when we look at the multi-core scores, the M1 Pro and the M1 Max scores are both the 10-core version of that processor, what we're looking at here. So you can see with multi-core, the M1 Pro and the M1 Max jump up significantly from the M1. And I think the M1 is either a 7-core or an 8-core design. So I think it has 6 performance cores and 2 high efficiency cores versus the 8 and 2 of the Pro models. But again, you can see the M1 Pro and the M1 Max in the same configuration, the 10-core configuration, they're performing the same at multi-core. So I'm bringing this up because that goes into, if we're trying to decide, what's the right M1 Mac for me and where am I going to get performance, you really need to start looking at your applications and what you're using it for and what you're doing with it. So for a lot of people, if you're just doing mainly consumer applications, there may not be an advantage of spending all the extra money to go to a Pro system. Now, if you really need that performance, you need that power, it's available to you and you can sort of step up. So now let's look though at where the big differences are. So I mentioned earlier, with the Pro systems, that really the difference between the M1 Pro and the M1 Max comes down to the GPU. And the number of GPU cores available. So you can see here the M1 with its 8-core GPU, the M1 Pro with a 16-core GPU, and the M1 Max with a 32-core GPU. And there's big jumps up here, right? We've got almost double from the M1 to the M1 Pro, and then almost double again for the M1 Max. And so where this is going to make a difference, again, is if you're heavily into image processing, things like Photoshop and Lightroom. It's going to make a big difference if you're doing video editing, whether that's in iMovie or Final Cut or Adobe Premiere, DaVinci Resolve. It's going to make a big difference if you're doing a lot of high-end gaming, 3D modeling. If you're a developer and you're having to do code compiles and all those sorts of things, that's going to leverage a lot of the multi-core technology and take advantage of what's available in the GPU. That all make sense? Any questions on any of that stuff? No? Okay, cool.
I wondered, is there a MacBook that has just an M1, not an M1 Pro or M1?
There's actually 2 of them. There is the 13-inch MacBook Pro, and there is the M1 MacBook Air. So the current MacBook Air and the current 13-inch version of the MacBook Pro both use just the M1 processor.
Oh, thank you.
Can you explain what the core, what do you mean by core?
Core? Is that what I heard? Explain what I mean by core?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, sure. So processors these days, so it used to be back in the day, right? We would have a processor and that would just be the CPU. What they started doing with more modern processors is basically putting in multiple cores, and it basically, each core is like its own little CPU within the main CPU. And so what can happen with modern software, the way it's written, is certain applications can take advantage of that, and they can divide up the work between the different cores or the little different processors. And again, I'm kind of simplifying because I'm not a processor engineer, but two, it's just, I think, easier to understand this way. So it's basically like having multiple processors. It's just they sit on a single piece of silicon. But not every application needs to or is designed to take advantage of, dividing up that work and splitting it among the multiple cores. And we have multiple cores inside the CPU, and we also have multiple cores inside the GPU. If you have, there's certain tools you can get for your Mac to kind of see this. I think you might even be able to do it with Activity Monitor, but I use a little utility called iStat Menus that can show you your CPU, and it can show you, if you have a multi-core application, how much processor load is being divided out to each core when you're running an application. So you could run an application like Photoshop, you could look at the different tasks, and you could see, how much CPU is being used for each core. So does that kind of explain the cores?
Yes, that's good. Thank you.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, this is the 4th time we've done a processor transition. I think one thing that we probably want to talk about, and probably I think is a question I get asked most often about this, is, am I going to be able to take my software with me? What happens if, I have an Intel Mac now? What happens if I go get one of these new M1 systems? Is it going to run everything? Am I going to be able to use all my applications? How am I going to make this transition? Is it going to be rough? Am I going to have to read my software and stuff like that? Well, luckily, because Apple's been through this a few times, I think they try to have our back as best as possible. So they provided some ways to actually help us transition. Now, it is true that with applications, the Intel apps that we have today run on an instruction set called x86. These new M1 systems use a instruction set, and the instruction set is just basically how the software talks to the processor, and the processor knows what to do, right? So the processors from the different companies, Intel versus Apple, use different instruction set, basically just a different language. And so you can't just take the one and run it on the other. So Apple devised some technologies to help us make a transition from Intel to Apple Silicon. And one of the first technologies they have is something called Universal 2. And this gives developers who are already creating and writing Intel apps the ability, with a little bit of extra work, to basically rebuild their applications with binaries or instructions, basically, that understand both Intel and Apple Silicon. And so with Universal 2, wait, I might be mixing them up. Hold on a second, I might have told you the wrong thing. So yeah, so it gives developers the ability to create binaries for both systems, but they do have to do a little extra work. And with universal applications, basically, they're writing the programs in a way that they will run natively on either instruction set. So this can take a little while, as some developers, depending upon their application, do have to do some work. But it is the way generally you want to run your applications. You're going to get better performance. The apps are going to run better if they're written in the native instruction set of the processor. So that's one technology. It's really something that's made available for developers so that they can take their old Intel apps and then convert them and port them over to the new processors. The second technology that Apple put out is kind of the way they can more immediately handle the transition, and that is something called Rosetta 2. It's what's called a real-time translation layer. And like I said, the problem here is that the instruction set for Intel, the language that Intel speaks, is different than the language that Apple Silicon speaks. And so Rosetta acts as a translation layer, basically, translating the language from one system to another. What that means for us is that even if you got a new M1 system now, and even if the developer had not converted their application over to run natively on the new Apple Silicon processor, most apps are going to be able to run just fine using the Rosetta technology. So far as I know, I haven't heard of too many problems or too many apps that aren't running natively, and developers have been working very, very quickly to convert their apps. Some graphic intensive applications that use technologies like Metal, which is Apple's graphics layer, they might perform better on Rosetta than the M1 natively before they get converted. But once the conversion happens, that's really the applications that you want to be running. And there actually is a website called Is Apple Silicon Ready, where you can check and you can see which programs, which applications have already been converted over to run natively on the new platform. But all this is just a way of saying that really this processor transition has been pretty smooth. Almost all the applications that you run currently, if you have an Intel system, are going to run on a new system, either with a new version coming from the developer that runs natively, or just running with the Rosetta 2 layer. So I actually don't even have an M1 system yet, but I did get one for my wife, and we converted her over, and she's been able to run just everything without any hiccups. Has been my experience. So I don't know if other people here have been through the M1 transition yet, but it is relatively smooth. And then there is one other kind of interesting benefit of the new M1 systems. As I mentioned earlier, Apple's been building their own processors for our iOS devices, our iPhones and our iPads for years. They also use the ARM technology, so the same instruction set. So Apple has also built the ability with these new M1 systems for them to be able to run your iOS applications, the applications you would run on your iPhone or iPad, on the M1 Max. Now, this is something that is dependent upon the developer. So developers were given the option to opt out of allowing their iOS applications to run on the Mac, and some did, but there are iOS apps that will run on the Mac now. They have to do a little bit of work, because obviously iOS apps were originally, most of them, designed for a touch interface, and the Macintosh does not have a touch screen. We use trackpads and mice and keyboards, and so it might be mixed experiences running iOS apps on the Mac. Some work great and some maybe not as great. And I see a question.
Yes. Why is it that I can't do like a touch tablet on a Microsoft Service tablet on my Mac?
It's that way because Apple has decided that the touch experience that they want to deliver is an iPad with an attached keyboard and mouse. And if you want that experience, you get iOS and you get an iPad. And if you want a laptop experience, you get a notebook, you get a laptop. So it's really, they feel that the two experiences, the two sort of interactions are different and designed to be different. And it really comes down to that. They could easily create a touchscreen notebook if they wanted to, but it's not the direction they've decided to go. I mean, it really comes down to that more than anything else. Yeah, I know. I get a lot of questions. I feel personally mixed about it. I don't know if you've talked about it in your group or not, but You know, I like my notebook. I like my trackpad and keyboard. It's even come down to the idea of, like, recently, and I guess this is related to these new M1 Pro, M1 Max systems. The question came up, you know, why don't they have Face ID? They have Touch ID, which is on the keyboard. So, you know, you can fingerprint authenticate into your Mac. But they have a camera. They have a camera system. So a lot of people have asked, why don't you do Face ID? And Apple's engineering team came out and said it doesn't make sense on a notebook because your hands are already down there on the keyboard. It's easier just to go up and touch the Touch ID. You know, a lot of us disagree. I think it'd be convenient to open up the laptop, the camera sees you, and you're automatically logged in, right? So it's a difference of opinion. Now, I guess if you've ever talked to an engineer about, you know, a project or how something's been built or designed, you know, like, different engineers have different opinions, and Apple's opinion is just that we don't need touchscreen notebooks. If you want a touchscreen experience, get an iPad. If you want a notebook experience, get a MacBook or a MacBook Pro. Great question. Thank you. All right, any questions about sort of making the transition and Universal Rosetta, iOS apps, that sort of thing? Any other questions? How am I on time here? I got about 8 minutes. Is that right? It's like, I saw somebody talking, but I don't think I heard you.
I think if you need to extend a little bit, but that's kind of up to Taylor. Is that okay, Taylor?
Yes, we have no time constraints here. Probably don't go a whole another hour or something. But
No. I'm actually wrapping up. I have one more thing to talk about, and that's choosing a system.
Okay, good.
So, you know, I kind of threw a lot at you. You know, really, at the end of the day, I think for most of us as Mac fans, it comes down to, I'm looking to buy my next Mac. I guess it's worth pointing out, this is Apple's decision moving forward, right? Just like when we went through the PowerPC to Intel transition, you know, as Apple brought out new systems, and as they're bringing out new M1 systems, they're sunsetting their old Intel systems. There's still a few out there. But, you know, moving forward, we're going to be Apple Silicon. And so a lot of us, when it comes time to buy our next system, we're probably going to be transitioning from Intel to a new M1. And so, you know, how do you decide? And I'm going to talk specifically about the new Pro systems. But obviously, you know, as we mentioned earlier, there are also the few options on the M1 side. But I think all of the decisions, you know, and all the ways we choose a system kind of are similar here. And so with the M1 Pro, M1 Max, Apple has, and they are MacBook Pro systems. Those are the only two systems currently with these processors. Like I said, we're expecting some desktop systems. There might be an update to the Mac Mini at some point. But for right now, it's a MacBook Pro, and they offer it with two screen sizes, a 14-inch screen and a 16-inch screen. Both screens are the same resolution. They're the same technologies. They have 120 hertz refresh rate. They're what Apple calls their liquid retina displays. So really the only difference with the display between the two systems is the size, 14-inch, 16-inch. So a little more real estate if you get the 16-inch model, a little more portability if you go with the 14-inch model. The CPUs are roughly the same. Like I mentioned earlier, there is a sort of base level version of the M1 Pro that has just 8 cores. And then there's also an M1 Pro with 10 cores. And then the M1 Max also has 10 cores. So from a CPU perspective, the 10 core Pro, as we showed in that graph earlier, and the M1 Max are basically identical from a CPU perspective. The difference then becomes the GPUs. And we've got the 14 core, 16 core in the entry level Pro, and then the 24 core, 32 core M1 Max. And RAM configurations are well, I guess I should back up. So they have some base level systems. So the base configurations, M1Pro, they have the 8-core CPU, the 14-core GPU, 16 gigabytes of memory, and 512 gigabytes of SSD. That's $2,000. The M1 Pro 10-core in the 14-inch with the 16-core GPU, 16 gigabytes of memory, and a terabyte SSD is $2,400, $2,499. And then on the 16-inch, they have two versions with the 10-core M1 Pro, and the only difference is 512 gigabytes of storage or 1 terabytes of storage, and that's $2,499 and $2,699 respectively. And then the top of the line sort of base configuration is the 10-core M1 Max with the 32-core GPU and 32 gigs of RAM, a terabyte SSD, and that's $3,500. And that's kind of all the base configurations. But the reason I'm talking about the base configurations is I want to point out that all of the models, and this is interesting with Apple, all of the models on Apple's website can be custom configured with any one of the processors, any one of the RAM configurations, and any one of the storage configurations. So depending upon what your needs are, you can really custom configure. So you can get a 14-inch M1 Max with 64 gigabytes of RAM and 8 terabytes of storage if that's the machine that you need, which is kind of crazy to think about. It'll cost you a lot of money, but you really can max out every single one of these systems, and so that I think makes sometimes the buying decision I think a little bit harder. And then in terms of like the extras, things like ports, the cameras, the microphones, the speaker system, the kind of keyboard that's on there, the Wi-Fi, all of those specs are the same. So they all have a 1080p FaceTime camera, HD FaceTime camera. They have 6-speaker sound system that supports Dolby Atmos and spatial audio. They have a studio quality 3 mic array. They have a 3.5 millimeter headphone jack that supports high impedance headphones. They all have Touch ID. They all have the keyboard with now physical full height function keys. They got rid of the touch bar. So if people were familiar with the touch bar and some of the Intel systems, that's been gone. That's gone now, and you just have full height physical function keys. They all support 802.11ax, Wi-Fi 6, Wi-Fi. They all have Bluetooth 5.0. They all come with 3 Thunderbolt 4 USB-C ports. They all have an HDMI port, and they all have an SD card slot, an SDXC card slot. So, I think that makes it sort of hard to figure out, like which machine is, if I'm buying one of these machines, which machine is the one that's right for me. And for me, that really comes down to what you're doing with it. And hopefully I've kind of helped out here with some of the stuff we were talking about earlier, because showing, what you're going to get in terms of performance on single core versus multi-core, what are your applications? Are you just doing email and surfing the web and maybe doing some Word documents, a keynote presentation, that sort of thing? You're not going to necessarily need to spend the extra money to get more cores in your CPU, right? Because the multi-core is not really going to benefit you that much. You're not going to need the most amount of RAM in your system. One thing to note about the unified RAM, it's proving to be very, very efficient. So it used to be back in the day, getting more RAM would make a really big leap or a really big difference in your performance. Within this new unified memory and these new M1 processors, there's a lot of people out there that are getting systems with 8 gigabytes of RAM, which in the Intel world, for a lot of us, feels like that's not a lot of RAM. I need more. A lot of people are finding that with the unified memory architecture, they're running just fine with 8 gigabytes of RAM. and the fast SSD storage. So it's definitely something to think about, when you're trying to make a buying decision of, can I get away with the base model that has 16 gigabytes of RAM, or do I need to jump up to 32 gigabytes? So what are you doing with it? Are you just doing daily sort of quote unquote normal computing things, or are you a photographer and you're doing 30, 50 layer Photoshop files and doing a lot of image processing, or are you doing video editing? Are you doing those sorts of things? And if that's the sort of stuff that makes a difference for you, then you probably do want to jump up to and would benefit from a better GPU or more cores.
Adam, I have a question about the SSD.
Yeah.
Amount. 512 or 1 terabyte seems to have been the standard for a while now, and it seems like when you jump up to 2 or 4 or 8, you're paying a ton more money. Does it still make sense right now to just rely on an external SSD and just stick with the 512 or the 1 terabyte?
Yeah, so that's great. That was the next thing I was going to talk about. So storage also becomes a thing, right? When we moved to SSDs and solid state storage, I think what a lot of us experienced, and it wasn't really fun, was it was pricey, and we ended up with less storage. So we were used to spinning drives with a terabyte or 2 terabytes for a relatively affordable price, and then Apple started coming out with systems with 128 gigabytes of storage built in, or 256 gigabytes of storage, and it really wasn't enough. Now we're kind of at 512 or 1 terabyte, which I get away with for my personal use. But to answer your question, I think it's really going to depend on the type of person. So I think for most of us, 1 terabyte 512 we can get away with external storage as a supplement. But if you need the portability, I know a lot of people who are in the field photographers, right? And they're shooting high res, really high end photography, and they don't want to have to carry around a bunch of gear, a bunch of external drives to store things on. So they will opt for more internal storage, and they're willing to pay a premium for it, because if I can have 8 terabytes on my 14-inch MacBook Pro, that's all I need when I go in the field. I don't have to take any extra gear. It's more portable. So this is what it comes down to, where I'm saying, like, when you're picking a system, I think you really have to look at, how do I use my computer? What are the important things for me? Do I need portability? Do I need more performance? Do I need, do I need something that's faster? Am I doing more, graphics intensive stuff? Am I doing more CPU intensive stuff? Those sorts of things. So I think it really comes down to that.
Man.
Yep.
On that very subject, I've just bought the M1 Pro, and I opted for much more onboard memory because portability, except I don't port. I sit in my chair.
Right.
It's got to be a problem having external drives attached. So it's a case where it's not the portability that's issue, it's just complexity. And it's really going to be nice when I get everything moved over to the M1.
Yeah, so you opted for more internal storage because you don't want a bunch of stuff hanging off of there. You don't want to clutter up your desk maybe with a bunch of external storage and those sorts of things. And again, that's probably the right decision for you and how you use your computer. For me, I have a ton of external storage, but I use, and what's nice about the new Thunderbolt ports and the USB-C connector is I have a dock. I have a USB or a Thunderbolt dock that provides power, and then I have all my external drives and everything storage connected to that. So for me, I don't need as much when I'm going portable and when I'm at my desk, I literally have one cable that I plug into the side of my machine, and it provides power and all my storage, and it makes it easy for me to get up and go. But that works for my workflow and the way that I work. I don't assume that that's going to work for everyone. A lot of people might find that inconvenient or not the way to go. Internal storage is also a lot, always faster and more efficient. So again, like video professionals want that onboard storage for shooting high-end video, plus they can edit really fast. It's really quick. This day and age with Thunderbolt and SSD externals, it's still pretty fast, but it's not going to be as fast as the internal stuff. So these are all things that go into sort of your decisions. But because all the ports are the same, right, on the machines, you don't have to really worry, on these machines at least, you don't have to worry about that too much. You're getting the same ports. So it's really going to come down to budget, screen size, right? Do you want 14 or you want 16 inch? And then when you're getting into the processors and RAM, it's going to come down to what are my applications? And then for storage, like we talked about, it's gonna come down to probably portability and convenience versus cost, right? So we have to kind of weigh all these decisions and then figure out, what system makes sense for me. For me, I think personally, if I'm spending extra money, as we saw with sort of the CPUs, unless you're really pro and you really need that top of the line performance, I'd almost rather have a little more internal storage than jump from, say, 16 gigs of RAM to 32 gigs of RAM. But that's just me, right? That's just my application, because I do audio editing. I don't do a lot of video editing, and 16 gigs is still going to perform very, very well. You're talking about 10, 15, 20% performance increases when you're bumping up those processors. And I might rather have 2 terabytes of storage so I can keep more stuff on my internal drive. And I also like a bigger screen, so I'm going to opt for a 16 inch, whereas somebody else was like, I really, really like the portability. So, and then of course, budget. Budget all factors in here. And then, some people care about resale. I will tell you, if you're looking at, I want to be able to flip this machine, having higher end machines are more desirable in the long run if resaleability is one of the things that you worry about. So that's it. I think we're a little bit over, but hopefully not too far. Like I said, my name's Adam Christianson. Can you still hear me? I think my headphones might have gone out.
Yes, we still can.
Okay, good. I only lost one side.
Well, yeah, thank you very much. We can open it for questions if anybody just, has some more they want to ask.
No, but I basically have an M1 Mini, and I have not upgraded to Monterey. When your wife, did she upgrade, or did you buy her a new laptop with Monterey already on it?
She didn't. That's a good question. I don't know. I don't think she didn't upgrade because we cloned her old system straight over. Yeah. So yeah, she's not on Monterey yet.
I haven't gone to Monterey, but I think I'm going tomorrow, and I was just wondering, have you heard any horror stories?
There has been some minor ones. I know there were some hiccups. Apple's already released some updates, I think, though, that have addressed most of the issues that I'm aware of. I'd be curious to know from anybody else in this group, because I haven't, I've been following it. We've talked about a few things on my podcast, but they were really isolated and small. There were some people that had problems with the upgrade process that actually locked out their M1 systems, but Apple pushed out an update for that. Or no, it was sorry, that was only Intel systems, not M1 systems. That was only Intel systems with T2 chips. So some of the Intel systems with T2 chips had trouble with the update, but Apple pushed out a fix for that. So if you're upgrading now, you won't get hit by that. That's the only real big hiccup I've heard of. I haven't heard of really anything else. There's not a lot of changes in Monterey, I don't think, under the hood. Not a lot of major changes. So I would expect the transition to go pretty smoothly for most people.
I had no trouble with Monterey, but I thought it was interesting this morning that I had to install Rosetta to get Ring to work.
Oh yeah. So that goes back. Are you on an M1 system? I'm assuming then.
And also, you need to download the latest version of Ring Central too. But anyway, yes.
Oh, did Ring push out an update for the? So that's what I was talking about earlier when we were talking about the universal binaries. Developers have to update their apps to run on the new system. If they don't, they'll run under the Rosetta 2 translation layer. So that's probably what you experienced. But it sounds like maybe there's an update to the app, and if you just get the updated app, it'll run natively.
I was about the T2 chip. Is it worth doing File Vault now? Does File Vault slow things down, or with a T2 chip, does it not make a difference anymore?
Really, just File Vault 2. I've been using File Vault 2 for years. I don't know about other people. File Vault was kind of bad in the early days, but yeah, since they went to File Vault 2, I've had zero issues. I run it on all my systems. I just turn it on by default, and I've never noticed anything with it.
I'm going to make a comment in response to Lawrence Jenkins' question. I have an M1 Mac Mini, which I immediately upgraded to Monterey, and I have suffered some memory leakage problems. Some of my apps have told me that I've run out of memory, and I've had to restart the M1 to.
Yes. Thank you for bringing that up. I forgot. I just talked about this, I think, on my last podcast. It's come up for a couple of people. Yeah, there have been some reports of some memory leaking issues, and it's not really clear what's going on there. So your apps will pop up and notify you that they've run out of memory.
I've been having that problem on the Big Surf, that I get that pop up and it says I'm running out of memory, but it hasn't. I don't know if it's not telling me the truth or not, because I have a little program that will try to give me memory back, and I'll hit that and do a refresh, and I think it's the Clean My Mac 10 or whatever it is.
Yeah.
It pops up and tells me I'm out of memory, and then I'll hit it and it says, do you want to? And it seems to clear it out a little bit, that I don't have to reboot my machine. But so it may either get worse or, but it was happening. So
I've always wanted a way to, excuse me, close all applications, and Monterey has enhanced the shortcuts that are available. And I found an instruction to create a shortcut that closes all applications. Real handy.
Wow, that's good.
That's cool.
Is the M1 any safer for virus risk versus the Intel?
Oh, that's a great question. I would imagine at the very least, just by obscurity, it would be at this point. I don't know if that necessarily means it would last, but just like we were talking about, like you have to write your applications, to run on that instruction set, on the ARM instruction set. So, a lot of things have been written virus-wise and spyware-wise and stuff like that for x86. I guess developers could just as easily rewrite that stuff for M1 and target it, but they'd have to like either rewrite it, or I guess it would have to run maybe in Rosetta. It's an interesting question. I don't think we've heard anything with regards to, it's just, not a lot of people saying it's just natively safer. But I would imagine it has to be to a certain degree, but again, probably just more because they haven't written stuff for it yet, because it's relatively new. We've only had the M1 for a year, but I don't put it past the bad guys to start targeting it, especially because these systems are proving to be very, very popular. A lot of people are upgrading and transitioning. So, hackers and bad guys like to go where the volume is, where the people are, where they can, scam and get the most people. So
On sharing
They're generally
composition,
lazy. They want the easy, fast money, and numbers help that, right?
on sharing composition across machines, I had an experience where I was preparing dinner and my wife was working on a composition, and through the cloud updates on pages, I was able to see what she was writing and glance at it every once in a while. And in the event, Apple event, they had people moving from machine to machine. They put iPads and how is that different? Is there more wrinkles that you can tell me about? I'll get into it myself.
Sure.
If you know it off the top of your head. Thank you. All right.
Yeah. So the feature that Apple announced that you're talking about is something called Universal Control. It's actually not out yet. It's part of the Monterey update. I don't think they've released it yet. It's supposed to happen before the end of the year. What that technology is that is going to allow you to use a single connected like mouse and keyboard between all of your devices. So you can have your iPhone, your Mac, and your iPad sitting on your desk. You can have a Bluetooth keyboard and mouse connected to each one of those devices, and basically seamlessly move your mouse from one device to the other. And as you do that, it will move control of those input devices to that device. So that technology is really about just having like a single keyboard and mouse that can work across all your devices, and you don't have to worry about pairing and unpairing and like we do today. So like if you had a Bluetooth, like a Magic keyboard and a Magic trackpad, and you can connect those to your phone and your iPad today, but you'd have to like switch manually. What they're bringing is this ability to have that be seamless, so you don't have to worry about that. You just literally would move your mouse from one device to the other, and that keyboard and mouse would now be controlling that device. The cloud document sharing that you're talking about is been around for a while, and that's just if you have documents in the cloud, if you make a change on one system, that change is automatically synced up to iCloud and then back down to your other device. So if I'm working on a Pages document here, like you said, and I type something and I have my iPad over here with the same Pages document that's in iCloud over there, I'm going to see the change happening instantaneously.
And I was happy that there was an edit button, so I wouldn't interfere with her typing at the same time by accidentally doing something.
Yeah, so you can take control. Yeah.
Yeah, so I can give yield control. Okay, good. Thank you.
Yep. You're welcome. Any other questions? Comments? This is really fun, man. Thank you for inviting me. I have up on my screen, maccast.com is my website. That's where you can find out about my podcast if you want to, or just, like I said, find it on your favorite podcast app, and my email is there also. So I know sometimes you do a presentation like this and questions don't come till later. If you have a question about anything really Mac or Apple related, I'm always happy to get emails. So maccast@gmail.com is my email, and I do respond to all my emails. So
that's great, Adam. We really appreciate you doing this for us again.
Oh, you're welcome. I hope everybody enjoyed it.
Certainly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will definitely, I'll definitely tune into your podcast.
Thank you.
Is it a certain time that it goes, or usually I'm busy, so I'll probably have to listen to the recording?
Roughly once a week, usually on Sunday evening, late Sunday evening. So Monday morning is probably when it'll hit most people's feed.
Thank you.
Yeah,
How long is it taking to get the M1 Max laptops ordered and delivered now?
I think they're back ordered, as far as I know, into December right now. I'd have to go check on Apple's website, but yeah, if you want to get one as a Christmas present or a holiday present, You probably want to order it sooner than later. Yeah, there's global chip shortages and stuff like that. Some of them might even, I wouldn't be surprised to find out some of them are even pushing into January at this point.
Let's things in perspective. I ordered mine pretty much as soon as they announced them, and I just got it yesterday.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you might luck out too. Like, another thing to do is, I know they always ship them to stores. So if you're interested in the base configurations, that's always worth checking online and seeing, early in the morning if a store got a shipment in or something like that. I don't know how frequently they're getting them in, but they do divide that up between online and, because they have Apple stores, they do still try to keep those stocked, although they go fast. So I think you have to be right on top of it if you're really good. You just have to luck out that they have to have the configuration and system that you want in stock. Sounds like a few people already got M1 systems, huh? In this group?
Yes, I got an M1 Mac Mini back when it first came out. Mine's the basic 8 gigabytes, M1, and I've been happy with it. It works great. It sits on my desktop. I've got my external SSDs over there and my 2 big monitors hooked up, and it's just great, seamless.
Yeah, I mean, these systems are blowing everything away, really. Like, it's a good time to be a Mac fan. Kind of exciting. I'm looking forward to getting one, although I had purchased a 16-inch MacBook Pro because I had to replace the system, and the M1s weren't out yet. So I'm a few years out myself of getting one. Other than I'm getting one for my day job. My work is upgrading us. We use the Mac Minis right now, but they're upgrading us to these new 14-inch MacBook Pros. So
yeah, that should be pretty nice. I've got the M1 and I've had it for a good little while, and it's fast. It's really fast. So I can't imagine what it's going to be like to get a 14-inch Pro or 16-inch Pro. It must be just unbelievable fast.
yeah.
Does the little mini desktop come with M1?
Sorry, say that again.
The mini desktop, the little,
Yep.
does it come with
Yes.
M1?
Yeah, they
Yeah,
have
that's
an
what I
M1.
got. Mhm.
Yep, they have an M1 Mac Mini. It's a great deal. It's probably, I think, if you're getting into the M1, that or the MacBook Air are probably the best performance to value you can get in a Mac system right now, in my opinion.
One thing about being an Apple user is you can't be an Apple user without having a few adapters lying around. I've found that the USB-C ports are really great, especially when plugging in, my high-end SSD storage devices. But I still have a lot of devices that are still rocking that USB Type A interface.
Right.
And was wondering, do you have any recommendations for any, I guess, hubs or devices so that I can, utilize those Type A devices still?
Yeah. The only one I can vouch for is the one that I ended up buying. I know a lot of people like the OWC ones, and I'm a big fan of OWC, but I don't have their dock. I have the Anker. I think it's the 13-in-1, or Anchor or Anker. I don't know what they go by, but yeah, it's a 13-in-1. So it's got the Thunderbolt 4 and a couple of USB-A's, and I don't remember all the ports that are on there, like a 3.5 millimeter jack. I'm using it mainly for the USB-A, and I also connect all my monitors into it, and it delivers, I think, 87 watts of power, so enough to also provide power to my machine.
How do you spell that?
I can just plug in the single cable, and then I've got everything attached to the hub.
How do you spell that?
I'm sorry?
How do you spell that?
Anker.
Okay.
Is the company, and I forget the name of the thing. It's got a really dumb. They need a better marketing department in terms of the naming. It's like the 13-in-1 power something or other.
Okay, thank you.
I can look it up real quick.
Jonesy, on mine, I just bought the basic TP-Link 7-port USB 3.0. And, I just plug in my thumb drives and my external, all my stuff.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah. Easy.
Yeah, I have a 10-in-1. Actually, for the USB-A stuff, I do have a 10-in-1. Again, Anchor, just USB 3 hub. So that's connected actually into the docking station, because I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think I have 5 USB-A drives hooked into mine. I'm a fanatic about backups, so I have backups on top of backups on top of backups, and I just use little cheap, 3.5-inch drives for most of that stuff.
Okay.
Wanted to make the comment for the M1 Mac Mini users. They're Sateki, a company. They make a nice little dock that goes underneath. Let me turn off my background here.
Kind of looks like it's a Mac Mini base.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah,
I'll put this link in the chat. This is the Anchor hub that I have. And I got it last year on Amazon on a Black Friday. Normally it's $300 bucks. I got it for $180.
Not bad.
So yeah, but it's a nice little dock.
One of the cool things about the Sateki dock is that there's two versions. There's a $69 and a $99, and the $99 allows you to put an M2 SATA SSD inside of it, so you can have external storage inside the dock.
Yeah, I've had their hubs before. I've never had their docks. I did have one of their USB. Again, one like 10-port USB hubs. That was great. They have a really nice design to them too. The Sateki stuff.
Okay, well, I think we're kind of winding down here. I'm gonna stop the recording here, but I want to tell you, Adam, I've learned a few things, and gosh, appreciate you taking the time to teach us this stuff and how to go spend our money now, right?
That's the problem, right? The impact this stuff has on your bank account. Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Okay.
Well, Taylor's got enough to buy us all one.
Let's go on a spending spree.
Looking forward you to come back when we come out with the iMac 32s and the Mac.
Yeah,
the Mac, okay?
The Mac Pro with a 40 core. They're saying it's going to have a 40 core CPU.
Yeah, we're looking forward to seeing you come back then.
Yeah, I think 128 core GPU, right?
Oh, goodness. Okay, well, I'm going to stop the recording. So
yeah, you can stop the recording.